we get started while we're being mic'd up, because I'll need to get mic'd up first. Thank you, all of you, for coming. This is the launch of the America's Quarterly fall issue. So I like to say it is fall in Argentina. So somewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, even if we're delayed by 6 months, we're still in the seasons. This actually, we had planned to do this earlier, but it coincided, because the issue was dedicated to the middle class. It coincided with the release of the World Bank global study on the middle class. And one of the people we wanted to have, Gemelli Riolini, was on his world tour, basically discussing and disseminating that report, so we didn't have a chance to get him here until this time. So if we're on an Argentine schedule, God forbid, you can blame the World Bank. But thank you very much for coming, and I want to thank Eric Farnsworth, my colleague and friend, and the man who actually enlisted me to come to this job. And on some days I love him for it, and other days I regret the day I ever met him. But this is one of those days when it's good, and I want to thank Eric for bringing me back. It's always nice to see old friends, old enemies, and the like. Before we start, I also wanted to thank two of our sponsors for this. The first is the Tinker Foundation, which paid for Matthew Singer's trip here, and also the Ford Foundation, which supported elements of this issue. I also should warn you that just last night we closed on the spring issue, which I have the cover of here, which is dedicated to Latin America going global, sort of the new agency within Latin America and its activities in the international system, its sort of economic prominence, and even sort of its pop culture weight that it now has, whether it's Shakira or Gael Garcia Bernal, the impact that Latin America is making in the globe. But this issue, the fall issue, is dedicated to the middle class. Now, all of us know, and we hear a lot about the growing middle class in Latin America. We hear it often in very general terms. Middle class has grown by 50 million. In the last 10 years, what we often hear. But we really don't know much about them. And what we wanted to do in this issue, like we always try to do, is sort of investigate a little bit more about who is this middle class. Understand it a little bit more, challenge some of these assumptions about the middle class, as well as even overturn some of our assumptions, some of our rosy scenarios in the middle class. So what we wanted to do is we looked at several things. The first is we wanted to put the middle class comparative perspective. How does it compare to, first of all, our own middle class in the north? How does it compare to the middle class in other developing countries? We also wanted to understand the consumption patterns of the middle class. We often sort of talk about the middle class in New York or in the private sector as this booming market economy, booming market rather, that we can sell to and invest with and open up checking accounts with. And sell microwaves to, or whatever. So what are their consumption patterns? Are they actually buying more? What's the long-term trajectory of their disposable income? We also wanted to understand their economic security. I've often maintained for a long time when we talk about the middle class, we often carry with us a lot of assumptions about the middle class from the north. Very sort of European notions of the middle class. They have pensions. They have basic sort of elements of social security, health insurance and the like. Sort of carry a notion of, if you will, sort of the Brady Bunch, very much sort of the idea that's embodied in the cover, having a woody wagon and a suburban house. So how economically secure is this middle class, especially if we only measure it in terms of income? And the last, well, actually two last things. Another is how democratic are they? Ever since the publication of Allman and Verba's classic study of the civic culture, we've always believed the middle class brings with it a set of democratic values that reinforce democratic systems and civic culture, issues of tolerance, issues of political participation, political engagement, knowledge. Is this really true? Is this Latin American middle class really going to bring a more democratic era, or will it not make much of a difference? And then last, we wanted to see how inclusive this new middle class. Does it really represent the rich racial and gender diversity in Latin America? What is it meant for Afro-Latinos? What is it meant for indigenous? What is it meant for women? Or are we simply just repeating a lot of the old patterns, or reproducing a lot of the patterns of discrimination that have been a legacy in Latin America? In addition to this, we want to take the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Ford Foundation's work in Latin America to look at sort of the evolution of philanthropy and its impact on a lot of these issues. So we looked at the issues with essays from people like former President Ricardo Lagos of Chile, Sergio Aguayo of Mexico. We looked at the evolution of human rights in Latin America from the 70s and 80s, the evolution of electoral rights between the 80s and 90s, and now today the challenges of inclusion, of indigenous rights and women's rights, of land rights. And so through a series of essays and a series of portraits, we highlight some of the heroes of that, some of the real change agents that have made the difference, and sort of the impact that philanthropy has had in seeding a lot of these very positive changes that we hear and that we talk about, but we often forget where it came from. So today, what we'll do is we'll answer this question. Basically, how secure, how materialistic, how inclusive, and how democratic is a middle class? We've assembled a great panel here to join us. I won't read their bio. Since this is a magazine launch, we'd like to assume a level of literacy, so I don't feel I have to read to you. But we have Matthew Singer from University of Connecticut. He works with the LaPop Project in Vanderbilt that produced the charticles, what we call in-house, or charticle article. It's chart article, it's cutesy, I know, but it's the graphic depiction of data that we often use in each issue. It looks at public surveys and attitudes of the middle class. We also have Maria Eugenia Boza from the UNDP, and she's going to talk about, and she writes about what the middle class consumption patterns mean, and what they're buying, what people are trying to sell them, and how they can adjust. We have Gemelle Regolini, who I had mentioned before, but I just like to say his name because it's kind of fun. Gemelle Regolini from the World Bank, who will talk about the middle class comparative perspective, how we measure the middle class. And last, we have Cecilia Lopez Montaño from Colombia. She's the president of the Centro Internacional de Pensamiento Social y Económico in Colombia. As an expert on economic development, social inclusion. She came at the recommendation of the Ford Foundation, so thank you for coming. So without further ado, I will open it up. What I'm going to do is ask them, this will be a Davos-style discussion, and I'll actually open the first question and let Gemelle respond while I'm getting mic'd up, which is, describe the middle class in Latin America. How do we define them right now, and how do they compare to the middle class in other developing economies?
Thanks, Chris, for the question and for the invitation. I think it's very important, before we even start speaking about the middle class, to actually think a bit what we mean about middle class. When we started our year-long investigation on the Latin American middle classes, we realized that everybody had a different idea of what middle class means. Sociologists and political scientists like to deal about, to define the middle class through their occupation and the way they think. Political scientists and some economists like to think about the middle class as the class in the middle of the economic distribution. And actually other people say middle classes are people that are resilient to poverty and have a stable income. And in some countries, especially the richer ones, think about Argentina, for instance, this definition more or less overlap. In other countries, think about El Salvador, or even Peru, they don't overlap at all. So I think it's important, and I would like the speakers, when they speak about the middle class, to tell you, to think and to define first what we mean about middle class. And each time someone speaks, it should say exactly what it means about the middle class, because I'm sure we're going to speak about the middle class, and maybe we're going to speak about totally different people.
Yeah.
So the definition we adopt in our report, just to give you an example, is a definition based on economic security. You are middle class if you don't need to worry anymore to fall again into poverty. Which means if you take that definition, which does come from some sociological investigation like Goldthorpe, it means that you have actually four classes. You have the poor, you have people that are not poor anymore and that are still vulnerable to poverty. And actually in Latin America, this is a third of the population. And then you have the middle class, which actually in Latin America is not the class in the middle. It's actually the class above, in the top third of the richest people of Latin America. And then in Latin America, you have a very tiny, I would say 1, 2, or maximum 5% in Chile, upper class, that I would say lives like middle class in America. So when you think about the middle class in Latin America, you really need to scale down with respect to the United States. In terms of purchasing power, the middle class in Latin America, I would say, is like the lower middle class of the United States. And that's very important to keep in mind. And actually, if you take a relative definition, the class in the middle, it's even lower. The people in the middle of the income distribution in Latin America are still very vulnerable to poverty. Now we got tailwinds for 10 years, huge growth rates, some reforms, some of this growth is there to stay, but if there would be a crisis, most people that are in the middle of the income distribution, or many, would fall back into poverty. Now, and that creates a contrast, because the people at the upper tail of the distribution in Latin America, what we call middle class, are people, I would say, from an income perspective, at the lower tail of the distribution in the United States, but they do have occupation and incomes that actually are similar of people in the upper tail of the distribution of Latin America. These are teachers, I would say fairly highly ranked bureaucrats, probably not the minister, not even director generals, but managers, are skilled employees in firms, probably not people who studied abroad. I think what we're observing now is an emergence of a dual labor market. People who actually earns more or less the same wage independently from where they have, from where they work, because they studied in worldwide renowned university. This is definitely the upper class. But the people right below, who study maybe in a good local university and earn a good wage. And so I think in terms of definition, this is what we should keep in mind in this discussion.
Okay, Cecilia, thank you. I want to get a good flowing discussion, so thanks for jumping in.
Well, thank you for the invitation. The thing that really struck me when I read the report is that trying to find what was happening with the middle class that increased by 50 million, is that we found that we are a region of vulnerable people. I mean, 38% of the population are vulnerable, which means they have a very high risk to go back to poverty. So I think this is crucial, because this has a lot of meaning. I mean, this really shows that our middle class is, as you said, very different from what the general pattern is about the middle class in the rich countries, but at the same time, it's a privileged one. It's a privileged one because you have 30% of poverty, of poor people, and 38% of vulnerable. So you have 68%, 2/3 of the population of Latin America. In spite of the growth we had, in spite of for example, Inter-American Bank called this decade the decade of Latin America, in spite of everything, we still are not the poor region, the region of the poor. We are the region of the vulnerable. So that's one first point. The other thing that I would like to mention is that we should talk about the rich. Nobody worries about the rich. We have to study about the rich. These 2 or 3% are getting richer, believe me. And in many cases, they live much better than the rich in your regions. Remember, we have maids, drivers, and nurses, all kinds of things. The benefit of having a lot of people being poor and vulnerable. So it's important to know that this stratified society has not changed very much from the fact that we do have some middle class. This is important, but we still are a region of vulnerable. The important thing is that, I mean, we have a very, reduced definition of poverty. I mean, we're really talking about the very poor. Maybe the vulnerable are the low middle class, isn't it? And then the middle class could be the middle. But the rich can be, not only in terms of income, in terms of quality of life, they are really moving away from the average Latin American. I think that's important.
Jamila, I just wanted you to, I want to ask Matthew about sort of the definition of middle class in terms of sort of possessions and what you use in surveys. But just talk a little bit about sort of how you arrived at the $10 per day income, which was sort of the threshold that you arrived at, to sort of fill in a little bit.
So it's actually a bit of a technical analysis. What we did was to look in a period of growth, because in a period of recession would have been much higher threshold. But in a period of growth, we looked for Chile, Peru, and Mexico using household panel data, the likelihood over 5 years that a household falls back into poverty. And we found that a household that earns $10 per day per capita in purchasing power parity terms has more or less a 10% likelihood to fall back into poverty in these three countries. And we said if you have a higher than 10% likelihood to fall back into poverty, you are not exactly economically secure. And that's how we came with the threshold.
Okay. Matthew, public opinion surveys. How do you measure the middle class?
Okay. So first of all, thank you, Chris, for having me. And in talking about public opinion surveys in Latin America, specifically, got to do my advertising. So the Latin American Public Opinion Project, this is a survey done with support from USAID, UNDP, and lots of other sponsors in around the hemisphere. And in 2012, the survey was done, I got to get this right, in 25 Latin American and Caribbean countries plus the US and Canada, give or take. Hopefully they're not watching on the camera if I got the number wrong. But in particular, when you think about the middle class, there's actually a couple ways to think about it. One, as I said, is in terms of what do they own? And when we look at that, the trends are striking. So like last night I was looking at the data. Since 2006, the number of people in Latin America who own TVs has gone up from 86 to 92%. The number of people who own a fridge in their house has gone up by 6%. The number of people who own cell phones, up by 24%. The number of people who have access to a computer, up by 10%. The number of people who own microwaves, 8%. So, I mean, well, we're not getting out of poverty, and we're not getting rid of the vulnerability that we really need to because safety nets are still weak, the economies still aren't diversified, and then savings still aren't high. But in terms of real material possessions, we are looking at a shift. It's not a huge thing, but when you think about these basic household goods you have access to, that's really interesting. And so when we talk, so whenever Chris asks me questions about democratic attitudes or attitudes towards the state, I'll frequently focus on those indicators of wealth and what people have access to. The other thing, though, we actually used in the survey for the first time was we asked, what class are you? You know, are you lower class? Are you lower middle class? Are you middle class? Are you upper middle class? Are you upper class? Not surprisingly, no one says they're upper class ever. And a plurality of people actually said, I'm middle class. And, well, it's a little bit surprising. I guess not that surprising. Think about how people describe themselves on surveys. The number of people who said they're middle class is higher in more developed countries, measured in terms of per capita GDP or human development indicators. And then what'll be really interesting, though, is that when we look at middle class measured by self-definition, and we say, how do I see myself? Some of the democratic attitudes of that group defined that way are different than when we define them in terms of wealth. And in particular, to highlight whenever we start talking about democratic attitudes, whenever we start thinking about people who see themselves as middle class, you start seeing an erosion of support for certain democratic values that you don't see when I measure it in terms of income. That it's that attitudinal definition of I'm in the middle class, and to sort of use your definition of I've made it out of this poverty trap region, it all of a sudden changes the way you see politics in really important ways. So that's some of the things we're going to see.
Give me a sense of, go ahead.
It's, I don't know if you want to finish on
go ahead.
But what is interesting, and I think it's a thread that you're bringing to the discussion is, and you do it by the self-definition, is when you see this story in the first person, so not from outside measuring what's happening, but you actually talk with the people, and I do a lot of qualitative research and interviews and ethnographies, and what you find is a bunch of success stories. People, all these, people feel very proud about the change because they have gone in a decade from washing on a sink to washing with a washing machine. It's a huge change, or having the first car, And these are success stories, and I really like actually the results you get. The only thing I don't like is the word vulnerable, because I think that word is great for convincing public policy makers that they have to address this issue. But you cannot go outside and talk, oh, you guys, vulnerable people. That won't work in politics, that won't work for marketing or business, because it's actually the opposite experience. So how do we bring that in? Mm-hmm.
Let me just direct you in by answering a question, and I'll ask you a question, and then sort of let everyone respond. You don't like the word, but I'm going to use it, though. what makes these people vulnerable? What makes the middle class vulnerable? What ways are they? It may not sell in politics, but I want to get at sort of why. Is it lack of social safety nets? Is it sort of lack of access to formal jobs? Sort of labor market rigidity? But Cecilia, go ahead.
Well, before answering your question, yeah, you cannot, of course, you cannot underestimate what's going on. Going to your point, in the report you say, this is very shocking. 43% of Latin Americans changed social classes between mid-1990 and the end of 2000. 43%. Most of the movement was upward. Few, but this is very important, few moved from poverty to middle classes. Yeah. So I think, for me, at a certain moment, I would like to talk about policies. Because not only the policies that produce these results, but the policies that you should implement from here on, recognizing that you still have a very big group that is vulnerable. Now, what was your question? I forgot it.
What makes them vulnerable? But before,
what makes them vulnerable?
Just pause on that at one point, because I do want to, it was your colleague, Jamila, who talked about, if you look at the demographic bump in Latin America, basically it clusters around poverty, and with small amounts of economic growth, or small amounts of demographic change, you basically can get huge numbers in terms of people moving not necessarily out of poverty to the middle class, but out of poverty generally. And it's basically because the demographic bump is clustered around that range between poverty and middle class. So it goes partially to your point, and that's why you see these large numbers that doesn't necessarily reflect a dramatic sea change in upward mobility.
But they are vulnerable because they have the risk of being poor. That was the way you define it. But I think the main issue here is the labor market. Yeah. I think the informality is the big issue in Latin America. We are the region in the world who has the highest rate of informal labor force. I was discussing last night with an economist that even the formal work in industry is informal now in Latin America. And that explains why the risks are so high to go back. And besides that, you don't have such a huge rate of growth. You have 3.8 is the average, more or less, for this year, what is expected. Of course, the world is only 2.2, but it's not the 5, the 6, the 8 that Asia has. So we have to have that in mind. We are doing okay, but we are not doing as Asia is doing.
What makes them vulnerable?
Thank you. I would like also to make a good pitch for the LAPOP, because people all over the region use Latino Barometro, and I'm not going to compare the two, but I like to use LAPOP.
I would second that, actually. But
it's very rigorously done, and actually what I also like is that when you have concern, you have issues, you actually can call them, and actually they do try to improve it on a constant basis, which is a very good thing for a value survey. What makes them vulnerable? I actually personally, I don't worry too much about informality per se.
You don't?
No, because
live in Colombia.
No, wait. Because I think informality is an outcome. It's not that because, what does it mean informality? You don't not register to Social Security?
It means a lot of things.
You mean if you register everybody to Social Security, they're going to be better? No, the problem is productivity. Yeah. The problem is how much they make. How secure the job is. Well, and of course, in a dual work like Colombia, where it's very difficult to fire people, you have a lot of benefits attached.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. It used to be. You have a lot of benefits attached to the formal status. Formal workers are much better off than formal. But I think the underlying problem here we are facing is that part of these great growth rates, or not Asian standard, but still pretty good growth rate for the region of the last 10 years, are due to good tailwinds. Commodity prices going up, a boom in mine extraction and in soil production, partly driven by China. So in a sense, the region now needs to solve. Labor markets are essential, but the productivity of the work.
What they have to solve is the model of production. I mean,
exactly,
we are just moving in one sector, minerals and oil production, and we are forgetting about industry, and we have forgotten about rural sector because of the model, because we suppose that if you have macroeconomic stability, everything will go. Yes. But it didn't work. We have how do you say desindustrialization?
No, actually, manufacturing is going down, and people
and agriculture is very bad in many of the Andean countries. So we have to change the model.
But that's one aspect. I think the second aspect is the region focused strongly on helping the poor.
Which is very bad.
That's
I think that's open for debate. Go ahead.
I
Let him
don't think I
finish.
want to actually go in this direction, but I think
That's very important.
a fact is there has been a major spending focused on the 20% of the poorest 20%, and that actually helped dramatically to reduce inequalities in the region. Let me finish.
Inequality?
Well, let him finish. Let him finish.
Then we can debate. And I think the problem we are facing now is that many of these poor people became vulnerable. But the social protection system is not yet designed for the vulnerable. Now we have a system that if you're middle class, you can participate to formal social security and you are protected. If you're poor, you actually receive fairly good assistance by the state. But if you're in the middle, we don't know yet how best to help you. And I think that's an aspect we should now tackle in the region.
Maria Henry, you work at the UNDP. In this sort of segment, and this has come up repeatedly, is sort of the need, we've done very good, the new wave of conditional cash transfers, certainly poverty alleviation on the cheap, very effective, but also then there's a question of sort of that vulnerable in the middle, which obviously you graduate from CCTs, but what happens next?
Yeah. No, that's a question that I think every international organization is working on right now. That is, what is the new generation of policies for Latin America, of development policies for Latin America? I work more on democratic governance issues, but it's the same thing for social policies. We can expect to have a different set of expectation and different set of challenges. And this is something that it's not by coincidence that the World Bank does this report, and in 2011 the OECD did also a report on the middle classes in Latin America, and we're all working on this. And one way in which we're working on this, the team that is involved in this direction is the concept of the middle income trap. It's just that the set of policies that governments use in the last few decades achieve results, certain results, but now those policies cannot give more, meaning they have, that's innovation. And because of our mandate and the strategy of UNDP, we're particularly concerned about the excluded, meaning gender parity, indigenous, rural populations, which under those policies didn't thrive as much. So we have now two problems: how to help the people who have done well in the last decade, and how to help the people who have not benefited from those set of policies. And probably we're going to have kind of a divergence in terms of policy. And we're all working on trying to figure out what is the next step.
Matthew, the questions about sort of the economic outlook of the middle class. There's a series of questions about how optimistic they were. One thing we did find is that, or you found, is that they are more optimistic. What's your sense of sort of this? Because economic insecurity and pessimism can lead to very volatile political situations.
Yeah. So when you look at the data on attitudes towards the economy in Latin America, good and bad news. Good news is people are more optimistic now than they were 6 years ago, 4 years ago, even 2 years ago. And even these growth rates, well, they're not Asian growth rates, 3.8% compared to a 2.2 national or world average, or compared to what Europe's average for the last 4 years. It's not that bad. And so that's the good news. And when we look at the middle class, or those that have more income, they're actually even then increasingly optimistic about it. And that attitudes towards the economy are stronger among those who are doing better. And speaking of that theme of the groups that are left behind, the 2012 Latin American Public Opinion Project report focuses on those discriminated groups. We have 3 chapters focusing on those issues and documenting that, well, on average, people are doing really well. If you're indigenous living in rural areas and if you're poor, it's really bad. And then, of course, huge wage gap by gender. And that has not changed over time. And that's true across all education levels.
Yeah, on the sort of the social, you go ahead.
I was going to say, but having said that, the other thing that you see when it comes to economics, I said the good news is people are saying, things are getting better. The number of people in Latin America who say the economy is bad still outnumber the number of people who say it's doing well. So while that gap's shrinking, even with 4% growth rates over the last few years, most people still aren't happy. And that speaks to these larger issues of, well, we're escaping poverty, we're earning some things. It's not like opportunities are great. I mean, it's better, but still not good, would be the way I would define it.
Let's go to the gender composite, the gender and the sort of ethnic composition, racial composition of the middle class. What does it look like, Cecilia?
I want to take 2 points. You said that people are still not happy. Don't forget that Latin America has the worst Gini indicator of the world. We are a very unequal society, and that's something you feel it if you live there. No matter that some of the groups are moving, there are still a large proportion, 1/3 of the population that are very poor. Okay, that's one point, and I think that while we keep on being so unequal, we are not going to be happy, especially if we're not part of the 2%.
But he's arguing for public opinion surveys. You're just making a broad generalization that people aren't going to be happy.
Yeah. For what it's worth, satisfaction with the economy is lower in more unequal countries too. We can actually talk about that too. I mean, there's inequality has real policy and public opinion impacts. And as much as growth is good, growth seems to work better in countries that are more equal. And even in fact, one of our findings is that the impact of education to help lift people out of poverty is mitigated in unequal societies. I mean, even the magic bullet that's driving a lot of these changes that aren't tailwinds that is actually domestically generated of increased education. In the most unequal countries, Colombia, Bolivia, education isn't having the same impact too because access to education is so stratified.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to go back to the social policies. I am not so optimistic about what happened with the social policies because of...
I'm getting that sense.
Pardon me?
I'm getting that sense.
You already made that point.
No, I know. Well, I'm Latin American. I am authorized to do that. Okay, but let me say something. I agree with you. I mean, a crucial issue now is what are not only the social policies, the economic policies. Because remember, there is something that is called the social content of economic policies. Mm-hmm. That now is a very important issue. But then the point I want to make is that looking at these income transfers, finally we have an objective analysis. And it says very clear, okay, what did they do? They increased the demand for social services. Okay? But very few countries really improve the quality of the social service.
By what measure?
I mean...
What's your measure? What's your
measure?
By
education, for example.
Well, what are the numbers?
No, I mean, education, you increase the demand because these income transfers they are not policy for women, they're policy for the kids. Okay, and we will go back to gender, that is a very important issue. But then they increase the demand for education and health and nutrition, okay? But at the same time, governments didn't improve the quality of education and health for the poor.
By what measure?
I mean,
this is a generalization.
No. If
you're just making an assertion. You're just making an assertion.
You still have very poor education and health for the poor. With any kind of measure you have, international
That's not
measures.
factual. That's just an assertion.
Pardon me?
That's just an assertion.
But what do you mean it's not social?
It's an assertion. It's just
what
saying.
What do you mean it's not social?
No, it's an assertion. It's an assertion. It's not a fact. It's an assertion.
No.
Go ahead.
If I may compliment, because in the HDR report that was launched last week, the global report, there is evidence of progress on health and education. Measure, for example, the quantitative measures measured in number of years of schooling.
Yeah, but what about quality?
Exactly. So there is progress in the numerical indicators,
but not in quality.
But the next challenge is quality, and we don't have good ways to measure quality of education.
That's the point.
You do?
I think there has been the UN sponsors the CERCE, and then there are the PISA scores. And I think in terms of levels, I agree with you. And I think you mentioned a good point. I wouldn't be that negative with social policies because let's not forget, a cash transfer.
I haven't mentioned the other one.
But a cash transfer, what it does, it gives you cash, it directly reduces your poverty status. That's social assistance. Yeah. That's food transfer in the US, it's social assistance in Europe. You might like it or not, but these people are richer, can buy more food. So in a sense, the cash transfer, the main objective is relieve people from poverty through the cash transfers. Then it's true, there was also an expectation that it would help break the intergenerational cycle of poverty. And there, I think there is still a long way to go. I wouldn't say it didn't. It did help bringing more people to health centers. It did help increasing a little enrollment rates, but you're right. Now we're facing a problem that the quality of education is still very much segmented into your social class. And you see it in the PISA scores.
Yeah.
So the problem of Latin America now in the quality, when you look at PISA scores, is that on average, it is among the poorest quality in the world. Many countries fare the same level as Indonesia, but they actually are much richer than Indonesia. So in a sense, they don't score that well. And the second is that the parents' background, if you look at PISA scores by parents' background, still influences dramatically the quality you are getting. So a poor kid is penalized twice because on average he gets bad education, and then he gets even a worse one because it comes from poverty. So quality is the next challenge. But honestly, I think the countries are well aware about that. They're starting making progress. We can't quantify them yet because we only have one wave of PISA. But I think if you go to Brazil and you go even to Colombia, there is a strong willingness to tackle that problem up front.
But let me go to a very important point of these income transfers. What happened to women? This is a very negative issue that was not analyzed. These income transfers were not women's policy. They reinforced something that we, the ones who believe in gender equity, are trying to fight. That is the reinforcement of women as providers of care without any recognition. And that limits the possibility of women to go to the labor market and really get income and be autonomous. So I think this is a big issue about the limitations that income transfers has.
Now. You're just making an opinion without any real data.
It's not an opinion. I'm sorry, it's not an opinion.
Would you like to finance a study?
No, but I can make a number of assertions that just.
The World Bank isn't doing this type of.
But she's stating as a conclusion.
But no. There is a report that was just launched last week by ECLAC, analyzing income transfers and the impact on gender, and it shows that I used to be a researcher. I haven't lost that quality. Well, anyway, they of course help the poor. They alleviate poverty. That's real. But in terms of women, the impact has been very negative because it has reinforced the maternal role, and we want care to be different.
But honestly, I don't know the reports, I can't judge too much, but there are two things when you do a regression, which usually you try to do in these settings. One is this little star, is it significant or not? And the other is the magnitude. My knowledge is social programs on labor markets have an impact, it's true. Sometimes they convince people not to enter the labor market, that's what you're saying about women.
I'm talking about women.
Yes, women, but to my knowledge, these impacts are usually very modest. 2-3%. Now, you're helping 20% of the poor. I would be surprised that an analysis tell you that half the women don't go to work thanks to the social transfer. There, honestly, I would start doubting the analysis. But if it's a modest impact, you need to balance the direct impact on poverty with some labor market distortion, which honestly,
but let me add something. In Latin America, women on average are more educated than men. You see that even in the rural sectors. You see it in the younger generations in the rural sector. So if women are getting more educated than men in average, then why do you have such a big gap in terms of participation rates? Women participation rates in the rural sector are very low, are 30%, and men are 70%. So if women are more educated than men and getting more and more educated, why don't they? It depends how you see the gender issues.
Let's move on. Matthew, you mentioned sort of attitudes of the middle class and sort of their demands and trust of the state. I mean, typically when we talk about the democraticness of class, we talk about several things. One is trust in institutions, belief in democracy, sort of the classic, there's a battery of questions that LaPop uses, democracy is the best form of government, save all others. What is, in the terms of their trust in democracy, in terms of their levels of political participation, in terms of their knowledge of the political system, what do you see in terms of this new middle class?
Okay. Sorry, I was just looking up something. I was just curious. We still find that women are less educated than men on average. That's what our survey data says.
Are what?
Less educated.
Less educated?
Yeah.
I don't know what you read, but I'm sorry, but in Latin America,
yeah, let's just move on. Sorry.
Wait.
No.
Sir,
stop.
I'm sorry, but I can't
You're just
talk.
giving opinions with no data.
It's not opinion, sir. If you read anything from ECLAC, that is a very serious United Nations agency. Women on average are getting more educated than men in Latin America.
He's speaking probably about average education. You might be speaking about enrollment, which are to
No,
different
no
issues.
enrollment. I mean, education.
But
yes,
it's all good.
education.
But yeah, so that's just what our polls say. And so, but the big thing we wanted to talk about though was on democratic attitudes, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what I'd ask.
So I got to get back to this topic. Okay. So again, good news, bad news. So when you think about the middle class, education is sort of one of those defining characteristics. Education is, if I want to talk about a magic bullet for democratic attitudes, that's it. So the more educated you are, the more likely you are to think that democracy is the best system, and more importantly, the more likely you are to think, should my political rivals have political rights? Should a candidate I don't agree with be allowed to go on TV, allowed to run for office? Should people be allowed to protest? Well, there's all these we call them in the laptop world, we call this tolerance towards your political rivals. Education universally makes that higher, and that's a good thing. Whenever you can have, say, I don't agree with you, but I'll let you talk. That's an important thing for democracy. So that's the good news. Now we get to the bad news. So the middle class. And in particular, when we look at people and we say, what are you? And if you say you're middle class, turns out they love the current set of institutions. So when you say, do you trust the government? Do you trust, is the rule of law working in your country? Do you trust the institutions? Series of batteries on that. Middle class individuals are substantially more likely to be in support of the current system than the lower class individuals. And you're catching the bad news of that. When it comes to protests, when it comes to tolerating alternative viewpoints, when it comes to letting people challenge the existing system, the middle class is substantially less tolerant than the lower classes are. And that's an important thing. Yeah. And that builds on some research that I've been doing, looking at people who think the economy is doing well or less tolerant, people who think the government's doing well or less tolerant. In general, this is the bad side of good things. I call these democracies winners, or the current system's winners. They're the ones that don't like it when people are going to try and rock the boat.
So this is the equivalent of sort of reaching at a certain status and then pulling the ladder up behind you, basically.
Especially, yeah. I mean, once you've reached middle class, and especially when you start defining yourself a middle class in Latin America, yeah. Like you said, it's a success story. But you also say, I've won, and let's not change anything. This is good. And so when it comes to democratic attitudes, these differences aren't huge. And like you said, there's a difference between significant finding and substantive findings. This isn't a huge thing. And I'd still rather have the high education leading to more tolerance. That's the investment I'd still rather make. But it is something to sort of keep track of, that it's not that the middle class is magically more supportive of these democratic attitudes. They're not.
Gemelli.
I think you raise a very important point, and it's important to kill a myth, because when you open a newspaper, you keep reading, the middle class are going to bring positive change, good reform. Now let's think about the middle class in Latin America. What do they do? As soon as you have money, you send your kids to private school, you buy a private health insurance, you buy a private security guard. In the Dominican Republic, you buy your own electricity generation. You opt out from the social contract, and you kind of forget the one that are left behind, and you don't want to pay taxes because all your services you buy are private. So in a sense, I think we do raise that question in the report. If governments don't work to make a social contract more inclusive, the middle classes, they don't do that naturally. And I think that's something that there is a misperception in the press, that middle classes are that magic bullet, and they are not. That's just, I think,
however, I want to kind of get back to what you said at the very beginning on what is the concept of the middle class that you're using. Because the middle class that is in private school, has a security guard and an electric generation, is not all of the middle class.
Not the class in the middle.
And the problem is that we very easily slip into a very elitist definition of middle class. And the problem I find is that is the concept we have in our head. The way we see that, for example, in business decisions is, and for example, for business and marketing decisions, we usually use a different kind of classification, the A, B, C, D, E. Yeah. And it's based on consumption baskets. And there you see what is called the C, the middle class, is very elitist. And it's like at some point, we kind of narrowed the definition and left a bunch of people out. And now, after this decade, when a lot of people are improving their economic status and their consumption baskets, our concepts do not fit very well. So in a sense, we always have to go back and you say, what is the definition of middle class? Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yep. Okay, I don't know. I find something curious here. I am the only Latin American. You're Latin American?
Yeah,
Okay.
Venezuelan.
You're Venezuelan, okay. But I wanted to say something. If you don't have good public services, it's very difficult to have, because of the policy we used before, the middle class be committed with the government. That's very, very important.
What's interesting is sort of a lot of these assumptions about middle class that were made in the civic culture were made very much in sort of a Western European or U.S. model, that the state was actually worthy of trust, like it deserved to be trusted. The people are going to buy into the system. The people are going to pay their taxes because they trusted that their taxes were going to be put to good use. That doesn't happen in Latin America for the reasons that we've talked about.
We need them to pay taxes.
Yeah.
We need rich people to pay taxes, and this is one of the new policies we need. That will be interesting to talk about. What will be the new policies for this new economic and social situation? And one of them is that we need a fiscal reform. We need rich people to pay taxes, but we also need middle classes to contribute. Yep. For them, they need good public services. So we need, again, another type of social policy, more universal, that will complement these focalized things that we have now.
Can I bring in the business perspective?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask that. So let me just sort of frame it a little bit, which is, okay, so I'm, let's say, a bank, and I want to open up a line of credit, or I make dishwashers or washing machines. Are we looking at sort of this huge, great market now in Latin America that we can invest in?
I'll pick it up from there, and I'll get to exactly to your question. Just as in Latin America, we have had a truncated social contract. We have had a truncated business set of services. And let me explain this. When you are in the States and you say middle class, it means the majority. And basically, people say, oh, the 99%. And that means that there are a lot of services and goods that are available to you at different price ranges, but you do have options. That's not the case in Latin America. For example, you cannot open a bank account if you don't have a street address. And you don't have a street address if you live in a place that is not being developed by the government. So in a sense, all this truncated social contract has also excluded lots of people from a lot of the services that we in the United States and Europe consider just normal. And that is a very important component, I think, that both for the activities of the private sector, but also for the political process. This is very, very important. And this sense of exclusion. So there is progress, but it's also the sense that I'm still excluded from a bunch of things. So I cannot go into a bank agency. I cannot. And here, and this is where I want to go back to the business question, because there's another actor in here. What is the private sector doing with all this growth? And the kind of questions the private sector asks are different from public policy. And basically, you have two kind of, I would say, to make it very simple, you have two choices. One choice is you have been serving a rather small percentage of the population. In Latin America, I don't know, less than 10% of the population have credit cards. So when everybody gets wealthier, because this income, the growth in income is happening all across, you can move up with your customers. That is to say, McDonald's, that in Latin America serves a small percent, maybe 30% of the population. You can move up with your customers offering like more expensive version is the restaurant, like the Mac Cafe. I'm trying to kind of get connected. The Mac Cafe is like you have the little Starbucks version within McDonald's, so you actually capture an extra wealth. But you have a different option. That is, you can work with a new market. You can, that is pushing the consumption frontier. And this is when we start looking at what has been done, and this is something that started happening way back at least in the 90s. This is not from the last decade, because in some places this was happening even before that it was picked up by, to make a big report. It's that you have this automobile market that is much below the thresholds for participation. And I think the best example for that is what happened with the cell phones. The cell phones in the States, started growing slowly. and in Europe, and then in Latin America, this happened in Mexico, Venezuela, it happened in like 4 or 5 countries exactly at the same time. They offer, just by chance, a new option, which was the prepaid services. Up to that point, cell phone had been conceived as a very exclusive service, very exclusive, to the point that in order to have a cell phone, you had to have a credit card, because the only way to pay your phone was with a direct charge to your credit card. So by definition, and it was all a conception about an elitist conception of society. And of course, there was like 2% of citizens had cell phones, and that was okay, that was normal. They took, thinking that they could grow their market, they brought the prepaid cell phone service that had been developed in Portugal, thinking that they were sell cell phones to the sons and daughters of those wealthy businessmen, to bring the gender issue. And what happened was that the market discovered that now you had an option to get a cell phone without a credit card. And it was a boom. And basically, you went from 2% to 70% of the population with cell phones. And in Latin America, in all Latin America, you have about 1 phone per person. It doesn't mean that everybody has a cell phone. Some people have more than one. But you can say penetration is like 90, 95%. What is interesting is that happened as a development of what we call inclusive business markets. Inclusive business models, meaning it was an innovation, the market discovered this, it took a few years, but then that was taken all over the world, because that was the same model to develop the cell phone business in Asia, in Africa, to the point that it now, 70%, the penetration of cell phones in the world, worldwide, is about 70%. And cell phones have changed the life of farmers in Kenya and fishermen, and even in Haiti, we're doing emergency relief through cell phone transfers. Meaning, in Haiti is the poorest country in Latin America. What I'm trying to say is that what happens, what the kind of decisions and strategies that come from the private sector do matter on how this is going to evolve. And we see some companies, some multinational, some national companies actually working in this dimension. And the take we're exploring is how can we bring in the discussion on business for development and human rights as one of the components of this middle class market and middle income region. And it's interesting. It's a different take from social policy, but definitely there are interesting cross points.
Jamila.
Let me bring back the policy angle to the business.
Wonderful.
I think one thing we are observing, and we don't have data for everywhere, but we know, but we have data for Brazil, that one of the challenges for the future is that, especially if you compare with East Asia. In East Asia, people grow richer, and they keep saving and they keep investing. In LAC, you grow richer. First thing you want to do is to consume. You don't save. Yeah, and you don't necessarily consume taking a mortgage to buy a house. You consume for actual consuming. Buy a fridge, buy a car, buy a cell phone, and while that creates, improves dramatically markets in the short term, because actually you create domestic markets that are bigger, there is, I think, going on a bit a problem, because if you rely too much on your income through the bonanza of the natural commodity booms, and you don't start saving and investing, you might keep the volatility that has characterized the region for, I would say, a century.
Yeah.
So I think one of the challenges now is yes, you became richer. That's good news. You can consume everything. Why don't you save it a little? That I think something it's worth working on.
Yep, Cecilia, and then we'll open up for questions.
Well, just going back to policies, and what are one of the differences of now that we have a middle class? One of the big differences are what's going on with women. The vulnerable and the middle classes, women, are having a higher rate of participation in the labor force, much higher than the poor. So in that case, one thing we are working in our center is about care economy. I mean, if care continues to be the only the responsibility of women, they're going to suffer from time poverty, they're going to be overloaded, yeah, so, with care. So one of the things we're trying to define, and in Latin America there are 17 countries that are doing this, is to first identify how big is care. I'm talking about care economy, those activities done by women that can be assumed by a third person, yeah? Then, how big is it? You measure and you put it in an account, but the important thing is how you distribute it. You distribute and then you go back to leave some responsibilities to the states, which in Latin America is not always like that. Maybe they take care of the children, but they don't take care of the old people, that we're going to be a growing older population very, very soon. We are already there. And then you send some of those services to the labor market, to the market, to the private sector. You increase the quality of care. You free women from care and you allow them to go to the labor market, but at the same time you're going to demand labor force, men and women, to do that care that can be done by the government, by the private sector, by the market, etc. So I think that's one very interesting thing. Women are going to play a very important role now that you have more women going to the labor market, and it's very clear in the middle classes, but also in the vulnerable.
Did you have one last comment, Matt?
I was thinking about this comment about the inability or unwillingness to save. The other thing that's going on, of course, is we have a stratified banking market.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here thinking, man, we need data on this. We're writing the survey for the next round of Latin American Public Opinion Project, and I just wrote down the questions that I need to lobby for. Because when you think about it, why would, if you've lived in Argentina,
why would you belong in the banking system? Yeah.
Or if not just having access to it, but why would you? Do you trust the banks?
No. You only have a pope now.
Exactly. And in particular, I think when I remember the first time I was living in Latin America, the fact that I could get a banking account that had my savings still in dollars was a great thing. I admit I had no interest, but still it was a great thing because I had security. And so when you think about just that basic fundamental thing that some people can qualify for banking accounts in dollars that don't worry about currency fluctuations, others don't. Or when we moved to Argentina with my family, the friend who was lending us their house, they were talking about trying to buy a house, but they couldn't afford a mortgage because it was going to be a 17% interest rate. And I said, yeah, your wife's American. Go get a loan from the U.S. and then buy a house here. When you think about those issues, again, when you start thinking about this relationship between public policy and the greater economy, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we need to know more about, is how
agree.
people are interacting with the banking system.
Yeah,
and the other side of that is the consumption practices that are behind, because people have been burned with the banks in terms of negative interest rates and exactly, and just see Cyprus and the revolt around exactly the tax. But for example, and this is to make it colorful, an anthropologist's observation. When I was started doing ethnographies on I say, why are there so many little shops that buy and sell gold? And then you see people actually wearing gold necklaces and stuff. Those are savings. Yeah. People save in gold. Yeah. And that's why they need these little places to actually trade back when you need cash. They say, oh, it makes sense. So I wonder, what are the forms in which people save? And there's a whole economy of saving that is underground. The cestas, ruedas, sanes, or, they have different names that are basically saving cooperatives. And some banks in some places are trying to innovate in how to get in or how to provide a service. What I'm trying to say is there is a whole ecosystem here that we are not measuring, we are not seeing, they're not part of the urban, formal economy, and it's also real, and it's gonna.
Again, it goes to our assumptions of what we talked about at the beginning, and it's sort of our assumptions about the middle class and sort of the context, policy context, the economic context in which it operates is not sort of overly generalizable. Let's take questions. Right here in front. We'll go to.
So along with this trend,
I don't think you need the microphone, but identify yourself.
Oh, here you go.
Up. If you want to belt out a tune, you can do that too.
I'm Beth Marie O'Loughlin. I work in the finance sector. Just curious, with this trend in the middle class of greater consumption and not so much saving, But with the purchases of TVs, fridges, everything, how are they financing this consumption? Is it mainly through cash, or are we seeing a trend similar in the U.S. that people are financing through credit? And are we starting to see any issues with credit problems and debts to household debt rising as a percentage of income?
Go ahead.
I mean, if you just going to tell you an anecdote. If you go to Brazil, to a supermarket, at least in Brasilia, the price is not the price of the fridge you see. It's the monthly rate you need to pay for a year. So I think that's how people are financing most and most. It's through yearly, through monthly payment for a year and a half, and that credit boom is huge.
Mm-hmm. And let me just ask on all these points is when we measure middle class by income, how do you make sure that you're not measuring, or even possessions, that you're not actually measuring increased access to what could be sort of extortionary credit? I mean, in terms of in the case of the microwaves that you mentioned that were increased, how do we know that those are because people's incomes increased, or because they now have access to high rates of usurious credit that they're, and in the case of in income, is $10. You're asking about $10 per day per capita income a day. How do you make sure that that's not sort of credit?
Oh, but it's labor income.
It is. You're specifically asking about labor income.
It's actually.
And in possessions?
Yeah, it's
no consumption.
Yeah, we can't.
Yeah.
I can't say we can't. We haven't. And I mean, that's, again, as I'm sitting here thinking, the data on, so one of the questions we frequently use is, are you making enough and can you save? Are you not making ends meet? That one hasn't moved over time.
Interesting.
So I just ran that last night because I was curious about it. And it was, so, I mean, it's moved up a little, but it's not a huge jump.
As you would have expected, that's commensurate with the sort of...
But the jump in possessions, yeah. So, yeah. Again, something we need to learn more about.
But I do want to say something that is, people are investing in the future through different ways. For example, in Chile, people are paying for the education of their children, universities, and people are in debt for the education of their children. And that is probably a safer investment than depositing cash in a bank. But that is, a lot of, of the Chilean situation with the cost of education and education debt is actually coming from that. So I would encourage people to be open-minded about what savings mean, what consumption means, what buying on credit means, yeah.
Good.
I don't think the situation of all the banks in Latin America are the same. In Colombia, we already had 2 big crashes.
Yeah.
So now we think we have a strong banking system. We already paid for the losses. So it's very different from Argentina, I guess.
Yeah. Dana.
Thank you very much. Diana Negroponte, the Brookings Institution. Could you address this increasing middle class attitude towards public security and crime control?
Can I pause for a second and look up, just to remind myself what we found? So I'm just for the record, just so everyone can know what I'm doing to cheat. So this is our report, the Latin American Public Opinion Project report. Also, all the data from the survey is online and free. So like the reports for download, and then we had the handout out there. There's a little flyer, like through the generosity of Tinker and other founding agencies.
You do charge for the data, for the actual microdata.
Actually, we don't anymore.
Not
As
anymore.
of this year.
Okay.
So if you want to look at the microdata, you can as well.
I remember I had to pay.
No, I mean, what they don't charge for is, so we make it available country by country basis. Yeah. And then if you want the pooled data, if you want technical support, please keep subscribing. It pays for this wonderful thing. It pays my bills indirectly.
Does anyone else have another comment on that? But then we'll just take another question and then come back to you while
I
you're
do want to make sure I answer
cheating.
it, though. And also, it has online analysis free. So you can just do the bivariates. Now, having said that, on crime support. So what we see is that the middle class and the upper middle class are still increasingly the victims of crime. So that crime targets the wealthy. Well, no duh. The ones who are afraid of crime remain the poor. So yes. I can stare at the table. I'm the one. Yeah. I'm the one that wrote it. So, so it's a very funny thing. The poor remain more afraid of crime because they have fewer recourses to protect themselves.
But maybe if you introduce violence, like domestic violence.
And poor individuals are more likely to be victims of violent crimes.
Okay.
But when it comes to most crime, remember, isn't violent crime. It's another one of those stereotypes. When we think about crime, we think about getting mugged or killed. Most crime is getting robbed. And that's universally true. And the rich are more likely to be a victim of that. The rich are also more likely to then support crackdowns on crime. 90 to 8% sure on that. And
What about this middle class?
Yeah.
so that's what I'm meaning by the middle class. So because there aren't very many rich.
So the middle class is more willing to support a mano dura policy, is what you're saying.
Like I said, I'm 98% sure, and I will email you the answer because I should just run back to the back of the room, grab my laptop, and look it up.
But however, the data that is growing and it's terrible are the violent crime statistics. So we're not the murder rates, and the two countries with the highest murder rates in the world are El Salvador and Venezuela, and a bunch of the Latin American countries are up there. We're no longer worried about the non-violent crimes or robbing and this is the big issue. That's the big issue that we're seeing, and probably for the first time is crossing all over. As far as I know, in terms of also worried and.
Matthew's found his data.
I was going to say, no, I don't have, but I will say, though, I mean, it's growing perception, growing fear of that. I don't want to minimize it as someone who travels in Mexico. I don't want to minimize that fear, but still, 28% of the crimes that happened in 2012 were unarmed robberies. 28% were also armed robberies. And so that's the majority of crimes. When we get down to, and so unarmed robbery with assault, that's 13%, burglary 11%. And the relationship between reported crime rates, and actually the relationship between fear of crime at the country level and murder rates is relatively weak. It's actually, whenever we started looking at which countries is the fear highest, so
They used to.
it's Peru, Venezuela, Bolivia, Haiti, Ecuador, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Belize, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile. That doesn't link up to, I mean, I got hit a couple of the high murder countries. I didn't hit the biggest ones, though, there in my sentence. So Honduras, is one of the lower levels of feelings of fear of crime, even though it has one of the higher murder rates in the hemisphere.
Yeah.
And so what that tracks is, in part, if I look at fear of crime in the national capitals, it starts feeling more like you think it would with Mexico City, Lima, all the big crime capitals there.
And this reflects middle class. What I'm trying to do is disaggregate these.
I think that's what we have to look at. But part of it really is that there's these differences in how crime works within countries.
Let's take a few more questions. Jamil, I'll let you loop back in.
Hi. We didn't talk much about the causes of this growing of the middle class, Suddenly it's
Growing
like
of the middle class.
growing. Suddenly it's like definitely we have a sort of middle class. We are not sure that it's going to still there for a while, but everybody's talking about this growing. If it's real, which are specifically the causes of it? Is it connected with more distribution inside the societies? Is it connected to a new global arrangement because many countries are exporting more, are diversifying exportations? I would like to ask you specific reasons why this is happening.
Let's take a bunch of questions because then we can wrap up at 10:30. Right over there, we haven't taken any from the right. The right-hand side of the room, that any conservative ideological orientation.
Willow Darcy. I want to ask to bring a new thread to the conversation about entrepreneurship and the middle class views on entrepreneurship, whether that relates to small and medium-sized businesses or just values around entrepreneurship in general. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. Thanks.
Okay, entrepreneurship. Well, Jane, we'll go to Jane first, and then.
Jane Terry at the Organization of American States. I have two questions. One is the impact of remittances on this middle class.
Oh, yeah.
And the other is a Washington, D.C. question, which is why should we care about any of this stuff? I mean, what's the impact on U.S. jobs and U.S. security?
Good point. So again, we always assume this is going to get Burr and then you.
Kathleen Connell, UC Berkeley, and Global Value Advisors. Question on healthcare with a growing middle class. What is the priority for expenditure on healthcare, and how is it provided?
Okay.
Okay, can we maybe?
Let's just take the
5.
No, I'll summarize them. We'll
Carlos Marulanda. Starting with the vulnerabilities. Our region is losing territory against the developed countries. So we are more vulnerable. What does it mean for our people? Because now it's more difficult to find jobs. They are disappearing. Industrial sector, the agricultural sector, the commercial sector, everywhere. Our people, well, perhaps they have more education, but not good quality of education. And compared with the developed countries, it's even worse. And the other point is, you were talking about political engagement. I don't think this middle class is engaged in politics, but perhaps in terms of voting, you can say what's going on.
Okay. So yeah, let me just go through them quickly. The growth of the middle class, and since I know some of the work that you've been doing, I'll call you out in a few of this. Growth of the middle class in comparative perspective. I'd like, Jim Elliott, you talk a little bit about the BRIC countries, entrepreneurship. I think is and then remittances was a question. What this means for DC? Should we care? I think we should. We're all here, right? Otherwise, we're just have too much time in our hands. Healthcare, vulnerability, loss of jobs, job growth, sector growth, and I do want to get back to the one point that Carlos made too about political engagement, because I know you've read about it, and we are seeing sort of the disarticulation of, say, labor unions and other things that were typically the channels for the participation of underrepresented sectors. So what's happening with that? So I'll start off with you, Jamela. And
I guess in terms of growth, what really drove the rise of the middle class is higher labor incomes. People earn more. While social programs explain not all, but a significant part of the people lifting out of poverty, higher labor incomes explain the rise of the middle class for the majority for the largest part. Now, this higher labor income can be disaggregated into many things. I'm going to mention two. One is an increase in education. And that's good news because that's going to stay. Now, we need to improve quality. It's not perfect. I mean, let's not forget it's Latin America. It's around a third of the income of the US. You cannot pretend having a US education system. But education did improve, and especially the quantity of education. That's there to stay. The bad news is a lot of it is also the commodity boom. And I think there is still a need, if we want to keep growing, if the region wants to keep growing, there's still a need to work on the productivity side. In terms of entrepreneurs, the big entrepreneurs are the higher class. Middle class, a lot of them in Latin America are wage employees. You do have a number of self-employed with wage employees, not bureaucrats. Only a fifth.
Bureaucrats are the rich.
No, but that's depends on what. But a fifth of the middle class is around a public employee. But 80% work in the private sector, and for the majority are wage employees.
Even the vulnerable middle class?
I'm speaking about the middle class. The lower middle class or the vulnerable, it's a lower proportion, more self-employment.
And you have a lot of self-employment and entrepreneurship in the vulnerable middle
entrepreneurship,
class.
I like to define entrepreneurs, the guy who make a lot of money and want to do a bigger, that depends how you, let's say in the vulnerable you have a lot of small shop owners, self-employed, and it grows.
Small businesses.
But that's a matter of, it's not the small businesses in the US. These are guys who don't have a bank account. You can't I mean, when you speak about small business to a U.S. audience, they think about something different than a small business in Latin
Although
America.
I share your sort of we overstretch the term of entrepreneurship too far. On the other hand, I don't think people who do start a small business with all the sort of obstacles they face with it are still entrepreneurs. I don't think we should sort of call them as being informed. I understand sort of we've reified entrepreneurship, and it includes Steve Jobs, the late great Steve Jobs, too. But the guy selling cigarettes on the street. But we can't take it away from the guy who's selling cigarettes on the street, that he's taking a huge risk. Anyway.
Why we should care? I mean, why do we care about Cuba, which is a little island? I mean, you have 500 million people that are gaining purchasing power. I mean, if you want to let China get that market, let it be. But I think it's important in terms of economic relationship. And it's also important in terms of stability. I mean, these are people next door, and maybe you want this country to flourish and be stable.
Cecilia.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. I will talk about remittances. You know, we had a huge problem with coffee in Colombia. That used to be the most important product. And now we had all kinds of problems because the people are receiving very low income. But for many analysts, the problem is not the coffee price, it's remittances. Remittances are very, very important in that part of Colombia. They represent many things, and now many people are coming back. They had a lot of immigrants. Now they have a lot of immigrants. So unemployment rate there is about 20%, which is huge compared to the average in the country. So remittances is very important in many other countries, and especially in Colombia, for example, in a specific region. About the importance, well, we live in a globalized world, and anything that happens anywhere will have an impact. And let me tell you, we have a bilateral agreement with the United States, and the only thing that we really are doing are importing things from you. I mean, we open our markets, and we're having quite a problem with export now. We are only exporting to China and, well, the traditional ones. But the new products for us have been very difficult because we have a lot of import. And about political commitment of the middle class, I think that not in all countries, I think Chile might be an exception, and I don't know Brazil, but there is a lack of credibility on politics. There is a crisis of political parties in countries like Colombia and the Andean area in general, but you know what's happening in the ALBA countries. But anyway, I don't see the middle classes. That's why I see democracy and middle classes in a weak relationship, because I don't see middle classes to have a reason to believe more in politics of what is going on. And now, everybody thinks it's a sin to be a politician. If you're a politician, you're insulted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, sort of slightly more popular than used car salesman. I want to actually ask one quick thing on that is on healthcare, because you talked about sort of the care economy, which is important.
Yeah.
And you talked about the quality of social services.
Yeah.
And because it is important in the sense of, I mean, how have, in the case of Colombia, which aspires to universal health care coverage, for example, how has healthcare improved, or access to healthcare improved generally, and then across the board, especially across pockets of the poor and the marginalized? Do you have any?
Well, we now are in the middle of a great debate about healthcare. We had a law 20 years ago, and we did get something. Everybody has a carnet. You know how do you call it?
The card, yeah.
Yeah.
Insurance card.
But the services are still relatively poor for the poor and much better. So now we are debating a new law, which goes back to very similar what you have done here in the States to how do you say, aseguramiento público? Public
insurance, yeah, public health insurance. Yeah.
So we are in a debate, but now we have a coverage of 90-something%. At least people know that they have the right. They don't know if they do it, but they have at least the card.
Jamila, do you want to add something on that, just generally healthcare?
No, I think the question, if we really relate to the middle class, is at the moment you become middle class, you go private.
Yeah.
So I think the private markets for healthcare are going to expand dramatically, and because I don't see the government in the next 5 years to really respond to the need for quality healthcare.
But the private sector will be offering the services in the case of Colombia. It's not
there are actually, from the private sector, there are also this discussion is also happening in Ecuador, that to respond to the higher demand and this pressure for universal coverage, the government contracts out the private sector.
Yeah. Matthew, let's go to you, and then we'll end with Maria. A couple questions your way, especially political participation.
Yeah, so thinking about political participation, again, good news, bad news, right?
He's an academic.
Yeah, no, I know. On the other hand, how many hands do you have?
I'm an academic, but still, actually, so on the one hand, the middle class still does participate more. And that's the bad news is in that same sentence, that there remains huge inequalities in political participation rates, not just on economic and class lines, on gender lines, on ethnic lines, on education lines. Now, having said that, I mean, the other thing that was just brought up on parties is also absolutely right. You want to figure out who the least popular institution in all of Latin America and any other region of the world too. Parties are it, and they're just universally not trusted. And while I said that the middle class are more trusting of all institutions than all other groups, which is true, well, that just means they hate parties less than everybody else, because again, they're winning. And I think we could probably, my guess is there's going to be a caveat there, and we're going to call that caveat Bolivia. But other than that, I mean, where the middle class, where the parties that still exist are generally still middle class-ish parties. And the way that they relate to the middle class is different than the way they relate to the poor. And that continues that pattern of inequality.
I want to ask one quick, if your survey data has anything on remittances.
I will add Ecuador to Bolivia.
Yeah. So I mean, Ecuador. But I'm just thinking through the data and in terms of who likes parties. I think that Bolivia has been the country. Bolivia is also the country where, like I said, there's a general relationship between saying you're middle class and the number of people in your country that say they're middle class and the level of development. Bolivia is the exception, where the number of people who say they're middle class in Bolivia has skyrocketed. I mean, which again speaks in part to the politics of Bolivia and the way in which it's shifting with greater incorporation. And just, again, I think that middle class self-definition means something. Now for remittances, here's going to be where I'm just going to have to punt and say, I know we have data on it. I don't remember what it says. So the Latin American Public Opinion Project has questions on do you get remittances and from where in its survey. And so if I promise we can go look it up. If we had the internet in the room, we could do it now. But just I promise it exists, and so that's a question worth exploring. I just don't know the answer, and I'm not going to make it up.
If I can add some, it's very interesting to hear what are the questions that you have, and I would rather kind of invite you guys to think about this because a lot of this is actually asking, where is this going? Yeah. Some things like remittances, we already have a first indication with the financial crisis in the north, in both Europe and the US, remittances went down, and actually you started to see the other flow. Families supporting their relatives in Spain because they had to be repatriated or things like that. So remittances are there, but we can and the level of engagement of Latin American economies with the global crisis has been very interesting. So in this case, you had a global crisis up here, but not so. But remittances is going to be one of those channels. But I want to focus on the question about what does it matter. For not even for the U.S., for DC. One is, as you were saying, Jamil, the size of the market. This is an important market for U.S. companies. Second, something interesting is going on in the corporate world. A Brazilian company bought Heinz, and this happened like 3 weeks ago. So you are seeing all these movements. Corona, it's
Budweiser.
Exactly. So the thing is, you're seeing all these changes in the corporate world that are very interesting. The same thing is happening. Haier bought what was a there was a dispute between Haier and Whirlpool for who was going to buy the other one. But what I'm trying to say is there is a dynamic in the corporate world, and that is relevant, very relevant for DC. And the third dimension is. And this is, I'm going to venture, and this is completely personal opinion, it's not by coincidence that all this growth of the middle class has happened also in a time in which Latin American politics have swung to the left. And these governments, for example, when Correa wins re-election with 76%, he's getting the vote of the middle class. Yes. This is not the vote of the poor. This is the vote of the poor the vulnerable and the middle class.
Yes.
And it's the same thing in Venezuela. Meaning Chavez got reelected after 14 years in power with 60% of the vote. So, and you saw, meaning it's not the poor who is supporting these presidents. Or Dilma, last week they said, the polls came, it was a record high approval rating for a Brazilian president, close to like 78%, something. Yep. So something of what's happening around the middle class is affecting the political dynamic, and it does affect DC, hopefully. Hopefully they're going to have more interest in Latin America. That connection is particular. I haven't seen any formal, serious work. But there is something going on in there.
Just a last comment about people that I didn't answer. What's happening to people? I think that really is so difficult to know because so many things are happening in Latin America. You have all kinds of movements in all sectors. So there are some people that are feeling that things are much better and some people that are feeling that they are left behind. For example, if you talk to the rural people in Colombia and in maybe in our Andean countries, they will say, oh my goodness, nothing is happening to us. Because you have all kinds of changes. This opening, we are signing, for example, bilateral agreements with everybody. And that is changing completely the whole market. So it's very difficult to answer that because there are people that are left behind, especially because we're very unequal, but there are a lot of changes, so it's very difficult to know. The only important thing is that Latin America cannot go on with more of the same. Many things will have to happen in terms of policy strategies.
I'll end on that note, but say a few things. One is a very interesting, lively panel, certainly. One is what we try to do to get at that, and imperfectly also, is we embedded journalists in middle-class families in Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, and Peru, to sort of get a sense of what are these newly arrived middle-class families, what are their hopes, what are their fears, what do they want for their children, and you get a very varied picture, as you're saying. And this is, we in all the data, and all the arguments, we forget that this is ultimately a human endeavor. That people's lives are changing, and with that comes a load of expectations and fears that we need to understand. The second is, and don't mean to criticize political science, I'm a political scientist myself, perhaps a self-loathing one in what I'm going to say, but in commissioning the articles for this, it was amazing how little work has been done on how the middle class is shaping politics and political parties and political organizations. Political science remains very much stuck, I think, in an older era. And I don't think we've gotten our hands around it. And why it matters, and this goes to the point, to DC, and it goes to the point of political science, is if indeed these new middle classes are somewhat vulnerable, whether to recession or whether to social insecurity, lack of social insurance, I don't know what a precedent is for dramatically shrinking middle class. I know what happened in Argentina when it happened. It wasn't pretty. And it does matter, and I hate to sound alarmist, but in terms of our Washington, D.C. sort of policy towards the region, security and the like, a declining middle class, should this bubble burst, it could have very dramatic consequences, certainly when there's already an uptick in crime and a declining faith in the institutions. Last, I think one thing we did agree on, and I'm sounding like Matt now, good news and bad news. I think the one takeaway here is which we tried to do too, is to understand that our assumption of the middle class, we need to be very careful about how we understand it. Its textures, its rhythms, its humanity, but also the structure in which it's embedded, economically, politically, socially, because it is very different. And I think there's a certain amount of triumphalism when the journalists cover it that we need to be very cautious about. That's not to say to be negative. It's not to be good news, bad news, but it is, we need to be very cautious. And then on one last point, you talked about sort of the growth. I'm going to give one last plug. These book launches are turning into like NASCAR races where we have so many logos and advertisements. Again, in a couple of weeks, this will be coming out on Latin America going global and the positive and negative side of that. So thank you very much. Thanks to my panel for, I hope it was a lively discussion.